Russia is losing Crimea. Ukraine is trying to cut off the occupied peninsula from Russian logistics. Bridges, fuel supplies, air defense systems and military targets are being hit again and again. What does this mean for the Russian army? Can Crimea stop being a military base and turn into a trap for Moscow? Let's discuss this with Paul Lewandowski, a combat veteran from the United States. Paul, thank you for taking time to speak with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah, just one thing to mention. I want to ask everybody subscribe on Paul's channel, Combat Veteran News, and on my new channel, recently created Not Just Politics. So let's go. Paul, I wanted to start with the Crimea. Ukraine has been striking Russian air defense, fuel supplies, military targets, everything that I mentioned. And it's happening again and again. And this strategy seems to be working and has almost cut Crimea off as a Russian military base. How can Ukraine use this advantage right now, especially on the logistics level?
Sure. So Russia has used Crimea, and one of the reasons Russia desires Crimea so much is because it is uniquely positioned as a logistics hub. It has tons of sea access and also provides the Russian military land access to occupied Ukraine, particularly Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. And so for a long time, Russia has staged a lot of its logistics and support capabilities in Crimea outside of the range of Ukrainian drones. And the Ukrainian strategy, the so-called middle strike strategy, which focuses on using longer range drones that strike in that 30 to 300 kilometer range, using those has allowed Ukraine to target those logistics, not just the facilities, but the actual routes going into Crimea and leaving Crimea into the other occupied regions of Ukraine. And so that Crimea's strategic significance as kind of a peninsula out in the middle of the sea has gone from being an asset for Russia to a liability because it has only a few narrow arteries that can be passed. And that means if you, let's say you're a Russian commander and you want to get water to your troops, because remember, every Russian soldier in a position on the front line, they need, most military planners estimate, about a gallon of water a day. Well, that's tons and tons and tons of water. And you can do the same math for fuel, for ammunition, for food. And to get that that food and water and fuel and supplies to those soldiers, it has to pass through basically one of three highways out of Crimea. Well, if you're a Ukraine drone unit, it's not actually that hard to keep almost continual coverage of those three highways. And once you can see it, when they see fuel trucks or logistics trucks passing through one of those three locations, they can send those middle strike drones to hit them. And every time those, an entire fuel truck, or imagine an entire water truck gets destroyed, well, that's potentially hundreds or even thousands of Russian troops on the front lines who now aren't going to get that gallon of water they need every day. And every human being alive knows that you can only last about 72 hours without water at all. And so the effects are going to be felt on the front lines, and we're already starting to see this, where Russian troops, not necessarily in Crimea, but on the front lines, right now we've seen reporting that the Khyber Spit, a kind of peninsula near Kherson, that Russian troops there simply can't get access to the logistics, and that Russian command has actually pulled them off of that location. And that is very unusual in that Russian forces have withdrawn, not in the wake of a Ukrainian infantry assault, but simply because those troops cannot be resupplied.
Okay, so that's going to affect Russian army sooner or later, more and more. But do you think Ukraine would ever need a ground operation or, landing operation to liberate Crimea, I would say? Or could Crimea become something like impossible for Russia to hold because of these strikes that we're discussing, bridges, fuel supplies, air defense, and the Black Sea Fleet?
That, I think, is much more likely. A ground operation in Crimea would have the same reverse problem for Ukraine, wherein Ukrainian forces would only have three potential routes to access Crimea by land. It would be very easy for the Russians to run essentially the same strategy in reverse. And again, it may not be necessary because, as discussed, the very few limited ways that Crimea can receive supplies are essentially by sea or by the Kerch Bridge or 3 routes via occupied Ukraine. That is, if you can maintain drone coverage in the air, that's pretty easy to cut off. And the Ukrainians, one thing that we have seen is that Russian air defenses are kind of nowhere to be found. I mean, they're obviously somewhere, but they seem to be deployed maybe to protect Putin or to protect select key military facilities. But what they're not doing is protecting Crimea or key logistics routes. And so if you can get the Russians to start to withdraw from positions simply by cutting off logistics, you kind of don't need to conduct big, large-scale ground operations.
Can this force the Russian military just to pull back or, at least reduce its activity or presence on the peninsula?
I think definitely Russian command now is reevaluating what they're keeping in that peninsula and asking themselves, okay, can we really resupply these large bases, these large naval bases, these logistics hubs, because they have to be now protected with air defenses. Well, those air defenses have to be shipped there via the same vulnerable routes. And we're seeing already in Crimea, there are massive lines for the civilians that live in occupied Crimea to get fuel. And that's because the little fuel that makes it onto the peninsula, it gets diverted to military operations. And this is the difficulty that these civilians are having is a longer-term problem for Vladimir Putin, who, again, has maintained for now over 10 years that Crimea is in fact part of Russia. He's actually encouraged a lot of Russian civilians to move onto the peninsula, and life becoming untenable there for Russians is actually, I think, a deeper, more serious problem for Putin, even than the military stuff, because the military can find alternate logistics routes. Obviously, Ukraine can then target those routes, but the military is more easily moved and manipulated than civilian populations.
I was hearing from analysts in Ukraine and some people from Crimea saying that Putin doesn't give a damn about people being there with all this, fuel problems, food supplies and everything. So I think maybe it can be a very good thing for Ukraine if Putin doesn't care about Crimea as a symbol of his first victory in Ukraine. Maybe it's going to give us a leverage. Paul, Ukraine has also been, hitting targets deep inside Russia, sometimes almost 2,000 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. As a military man, how do you assess the strikes? Are they already changing Russia's ability to wage a war at all?
So I think the long-distance strike campaign is interesting for a couple of reasons. From a purely military perspective, it takes what has been historically Russia's biggest asset, the fact that it is a massive piece of land. It's 1/5 of the world's landmass. And from Napoleon to Hitler, every time someone has tried to invade Russia from the ground, that massive space has worked to Russia's advantage. In this instance, Russia's massive space is actually a disadvantage because Russia has to protect 1/5 of the world's landmass with limited air defense assets, and in some cases very limited. And in part because of Putin's own narcissism, he deploys disproportionate numbers of those air defenses to protect himself personally. His palace in Valdai famously has something like 6 Russian Pantsir systems defending it. And so Ukraine has managed to turn this massive landmass into a huge problem because wherever Russia chooses to deploy its air defenses, somewhere else is becoming vulnerable. And even in areas where Russia can deploy air defenses, they're often inadequate to stop Ukrainian drone strikes. So militarily, that is very interesting in and of itself. But even deeper, I think the Russian public is increasingly fed up with the direction of this war. Even despite Putin's restrictions on the internet, restrictions on even cell phone use, the failing economy. In some cases, when countries are subject to this kind of long-range bombing, the public kind of galvanizes in support of their home country, kind of rallying around the flag. But the Russians have been going through this for 4 years, and they are, I think, finally starting to realize that there is not going to be any stunning victory in Ukraine. The government has killed a staggering number of people. I think the average Russian now simply can't deny it. I mean, when you're talking about 1 million plus casualties, that's 1 in every 90 Russians. And so something like 1 in every 45 men then would have been killed or wounded in this war. No amount of media control is going to stop Russians from realizing that. And I think they're seeing all this and they're saying, hey, Russia has failed to accomplish everything Putin said they were going to do. And also, Vladimir Putin, a strong man, isn't strong enough to stop Ukrainian drone strikes. And I think that message is really starting to galvanize certain segments of the Russian public to start to become much more vocal about their distrust of Putin and their really just disgust with the war.
Well, the Economic Forum in St. Petersburg, I don't know, Paul, whether you heard it or not. Former Russian intelligence officer Andrei Bezrukov, he basically said that Russia should prepare to hide critical infrastructure underground and even make people live in holes if needed, just to keep the war going. Insane, not to stop it, but just to keep everything, this machine is going. And he also suggested Russia is ready to fight for decades, at least for 2 decades, for generations. So where can such thinking lead Russia?
Well, I think the Kremlin insiders, to me, that's less of an accurate description of what Russia is actually willing or prepared to do. Remember, this is a country that has avoided conducting any kind of real mobilization. They've relied on contract soldiers, essentially an army of drunks and prisoners at this point, drunks, prisoners, desperate, students failing out of university. The Russian system hasn't even been willing to conduct a regular draft. So when someone comes out there and says, we're going to live in holes, we're going to fight for decades, that's just incongruent with the actual realities of what Russia has and has not been willing to do in this war. And I think the real message there is the level of, in internet slang, we call it cope, which is sort of lying to yourself to convince yourself of something that isn't true. And the fact that the Kremlin's mouthpieces, in order to project strength, have to resort to something out of like a dystopian science fiction novel is actually more of a sign of just how bad things are going. Like if Russia had a real strategy to like turn this increasingly disastrous war for them, if they had a real plan to turn it around, someone from the Kremlin would have rolled it out. They would have mentioned it. And instead, their plan consists of having Russians live underground like ants. Like that's a sign that all the good ideas have been exhausted, and that's what you're resorting to.
Yeah, Paul, we're just approaching my next question or just a thing. Russian propagandist Vladimir Solovyov just recently gave an interview to the Swiss outlet Die Weltwoche, where he again spoke about how much Russia hates the West and just in face poor journalists, and claimed that Russia is fighting NATO, not Ukraine, the old fairy tale. Let's just listen to part of it and then we will continue.
Destroy us with your nuclear power. Come on, guys. We're not suicidal. We are just extremely pragmatic. If you think that you can come into our country with your weapon, with your people, and think that we're going to fight you the same way we're fighting Ukrainians, you must be nuts. No way. We'll destroy your military capabilities, your military installation, with whatever force we can. If you will not understand after we use tactical nukes, then we'll get back to much more powerful solutions.
But theatricals aside, is that really a responsible position?
It's like, like we're listening to the patient from psychiatric clinic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What is your take on that?
So he's certainly a theatrical propagandist, as I'm sure you have to be when you're having to spin the Kremlin's wars. But I think this shows there's a couple of interesting takes here. The first is that he's using actually the same kind of rhetorical trick that Vladimir Putin often does, which is Putin is very careful. He often loves to cite Russia's nuclear capabilities, but carefully words it so that he doesn't actually make a nuclear threat. He says things that have actually been true as long as nuclear deterrence has existed, right? He'll say things like, our nuclear forces are at the ready. Well, nuclear forces between Moscow and the United States have been at the ready since 1960. That's how mutually assured destruction works. Two nuclear forces ready to mutually assured destruction. And so often you see these propagandists state that. Like, of course, Moscow maintains its nuclear arsenal to defend the sovereign territory of the Russian Federation. That's how it works. And it's no different than the United States saying, yeah, if for some reason a bunch of Chinese paratroopers were to drop into New York City, we'd reserve the right to use our nuclear weapons to protect the country. That is something that the world has lived with as a core part of nuclear deterrence for 80 years. But it's the fact that there's this propagandist who also, by the way, you noticed he was engaging in a fantasy. He created a what if scenario, a fantasy in which, again, something out of maybe like a bad video game where an army of NATO troops marches to Moscow. But that's obviously a fantasy. It's not going to happen. It's in no way, shape, or form a part of any of NATO's plans. It doesn't address any of what's really happening. The Russian incursions into the Baltics, the Russian hijacking of Ukrainian drones and sending them into Latvia and Lithuania, the Russian hybrid warfare against the UK. All those things are really happening. You don't need to reach into a B-list video game to get your plot points. And so I think kind of the deeper point here that I think is more interesting is that the narrative of Russia is fighting all of NATO is actually part of a narrative that it seems like the Kremlin is starting to experiment with, which is to argue that what we would consider a defeat in Ukraine is actually a victory for Russia, that Russia was fighting a defensive war, and that simply having the regime survive, Putin will sell to the Russian people as saying, look, we fought NATO and we survived. This is a victory for Russia. And that is interesting, simply that's being floated by these Russian propagandists to reframe the war as Russia surviving a NATO onslaught or something like that. Which, again, propaganda spewing lies, never great, but to me it signals that the Russians may be starting to prepare their public for something that the rest of the world would call a defeat.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I thought will lead to that. Okay, but how is the United States, the public right now, seeing all these false narratives and lies from Russia that Russia's fighting the collective West, or these biolabs in more than 30 countries, including Ukraine? I haven't seen any of them, but still, they say there is somewhere here existing. So, Paul, do people really partially believe in that?
It is hard to say. I've seen polling data in the U.S. that says different things. I think a lot of Americans have real problems with nuance. One of the things I point out is that the U.S. has always been transparent. It has not been a secret that part of the U.S., we call it biosurveillance and biodefense, is that if you're a country that researchers dangerous diseases, one, the U.S. wants to know about them. Both, many of the biolabs were veterinary labs that studied diseases in agricultural animals. which again, if you're the United States, I mean, right now we have this screwworm disease that's impacting our beef prices. Yeah, some of U.S. tax money goes to these labs, and that's been transparent for a long time. The Russian narrative has been that these are secret weapons labs, and that's just not the case. This is publicly available research, and in a lot of cases, these were labs that were in, countries like early post-Soviet Ukraine, Ukraine in the early 2000s, where we said, hey, we want to make sure that if you're going to do research into dangerous human diseases, you should have proper storage, proper safety precautions. You should have proper methodologies for accounting for it. This is something that has been, again, publicly available, discussed, and I even made a video where I found articles from 2022 in the US media explaining exactly this. Our NPR, one of our most left-leaning outlets, was like, the Russians say they're weapons labs. Here is an outline of the fact that this assistance is absolutely not, it has nothing to do with weapons. And as I've pointed out, even if you believe in like the COVID lab leak theory, U.S. tax money going to these labs and saying, listen, let us help you store these diseases properly, account for them correctly. This is uncontroversial. The problem is that whole explanation, just the U.S. public is not prepared to believe it. It's too complicated, and the nuance is there's too much nuance, I think, for a lot of the U.S. public who operate via kind of headlines and tweets.
Paul, then my final question. There is also talk about Ukraine developing its own air defense system, something European in style, something that could play a role similar to Patriot. Probably it will be in action by September or by the end of the summer. So if Ukraine becomes stronger in these three areas at once, so drones, long-range strikes, and its own air defense, how could that change the next stage of Russia's war in Ukraine?
Russia really, Ukraine has made huge strides in intercepting Shahed drones, interceptors like the Sting, Merops, I think there's a few others, that have really become very effective at taking out the cheapest version of the Shahed. The ballistic missiles are really the weapons that are most effective for Russia right now. And if Ukraine can find a way to domestically source Patriots or a Patriot equivalent, or as I like to say, if they can build something that is 80% as effective as a Patriot at 20% of the cost, and the Europeans would love to develop a weapon system like that, because as the Europeans, the EU and most NATO countries have seen, counting on the United States to backfill you for Patriot interceptors is just not realistic. The U.S. has shown they're willing to expend huge portions of their interceptors in the Middle East to support allies that they don't really have a treaty obligation to. So I think the Europeans would love to fund a program like that. I think it would be it would take one of the only effective tools in Russia's arsenal right now and make it not totally ineffective. Again, even top-of-the-line Patriots don't have a perfect intercept track record, but it would really diminish Russia's ability, particularly in the winter, to target those fixed power generation and heat generation plants that are really, really difficult to keep running in the face of Russian ballistic missile strikes.
Yeah, I was just thinking that if that's going to be released, and massively using since September, yeah, it's definitely will help us go through winter much more easily. So thank you, Paul, this time for your interesting insights and answers. Thank you for your time, and see you, I hope, very soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Always happy to come and talk.
Thank you.